The gates of Hennebont burst open. A woman in armor rides at the head of the charge, driving cavalry into the French siege lines. Tents ignite. Supply wagons burn. A siege collapses through decision, not rescue. Her name is Joan of Flanders. In 14th century Europe, she directly altered the balance of war in Brittany, yet was later pushed beyond the central narrative of the 100 Years' War. How she organized warfare, logistics, morale, and authority, and why such competence ended in isolation and suspicion marks one of medieval history's most deliberate erasures. 14th century Europe was already a continent at war with its own limits. Political authority remained feudal in form, but warfare was outgrowing feudal rhythms. Campaigns no longer ended with the harvest. Armies were increasingly maintained year-round, sustained by wages, contracts, and supply chains that stretched far beyond local lordship. Kings depended on credit. Lords depended on ports. War had become a system that rewarded those who could organize movement, money, and morale under pressure. The opening phase of the 100 Years' War revealed this transformation with unusual clarity. England and France did not merely clash over dynastic legitimacy. They competed for access to shipping lanes, to allied territories, and to the logistical corridors that made prolonged war possible. Control of coastlines mattered as much as control of castles. Naval reach determined whether armies could be fed, reinforced, or abandoned. In this environment, peripheral regions acquired central importance. Brittany stood precisely at such a junction. The peninsula projected into the channel like a breakwater between northern Europe and the Atlantic. Its ports, Brest, Vannes, Hennebont, were not secondary towns but operational nodes. From them, fleets could threaten the French coast, secure English communications, or interdict enemy supply. Brittany was not merely adjacent to the war. It was a multiplier of naval and logistical power. Politically, Brittany occupied an unstable position. The duchy retained a degree of autonomy governed by its own aristocracy and legal traditions, yet it was economically and militarily exposed to both crowns. Neither England nor France could allow the other to dominate it. To lose Brittany was to concede initiative at sea. To control it was to gain leverage over the entire western theater of the war. This strategic value intensified internal tension. Breton noble houses aligned themselves along external lines of support, not out of ideology but survival. English backing promised naval protection and access to mercenary manpower. French backing offered legitimacy through proximity to royal authority. Succession disputes within Brittany were therefore never local matters. They were immediately absorbed into the wider Anglo-French conflict. Maritime culture further complicated the picture. The Channel was not governed solely by royal fleets. Privateers, pirates, and wreckers operated alongside sanctioned naval forces, blurring the line between commerce and warfare. Ships carried grain and troops one season, raided enemy coasts the next. Authority at sea was negotiated through violence as much as law. Control depended on who could pay crews, protect harbors, and punish defection. Within this system, women were visible but constrained. Noblewomen managed estates, arranged alliances, and safeguarded inheritance during male absence. They exercised authority within households and lordships, but not openly on campaign. Military command remained formally masculine, embedded in rituals of knighthood and fealty that excluded female leadership. A woman could govern land. She was not expected to direct war. It was into this environment, strategically volatile, structurally shifting, and rigidly gendered, that Joan of Flanders entered history. Her actions would not overturn the system. They would expose its flexibility under crisis and the selective memory that followed. Joan of Flanders emerged from one of the most politically saturated regions of medieval Europe. Born into the upper nobility of Flanders, she belonged to a society shaped by dense urban wealth, international trade, and constant negotiation between local autonomy and royal pressure. Flanders was not a frontier culture. It was a zone of contracts, alliances, and calculated force. Authority there was learned early, not proclaimed later. Her education followed the expectations of her class rather than her sex. Noble daughters were trained to administer estates, supervise revenues, and navigate aristocratic networks that crossed borders. Marriage was not simply domestic arrangement, but strategic alignment. Through such preparation, Joan absorbed the mechanics of power long before she faced open crisis. Governance, not combat, was the language she was taught to speak fluently. What the record does not provide is equally instructive. There is no evidence of formal military training in her youth. No chronicler describes lessons in arms riding or battlefield command. This absence has often been treated as disqualification, as if competence requires documentation. In reality, the silence reflects the limits of medieval record-keeping and its assumptions about what knowledge was worth preserving. Skills acquired informally through observation, estate defense, and crisis management rarely entered the archive. Joan's environment supplied these informal lessons in abundance. Noble households functioned as administrative centers and defensive units. Lords were absent for campaigns. Castles required coordination of guards, supplies, and labor. Decisions were made under pressure, often by those left behind. Authority was exercised not through ritual command, but through effective response. In such spaces, the boundary between governance and warfare blurred. Early indications of Joan's capacity appear not in martial description, but in reaction to instability. Chroniclers note her decisiveness during moments of uncertainty, her willingness to act independently rather than await instruction. These observations are not framed as praise. They are recorded almost defensively as anomalies requiring explanation. Yet they reveal a pattern. When structures hesitated, she moved. This tendency matters because it defines the nature of her later authority. Joan did not claim legitimacy through tradition or title. She demonstrated it through action when alternatives failed. Her power was situational, emerging from vacuum rather than inheritance. Such authority was tolerated in emergency but resisted once order seemed restorable. The formative phase of Joan's life therefore resists heroic framing. There is no sudden revelation, no symbolic arming. What exists instead is a gradual accumulation of administrative competence and crisis management in a world that did not expect her to wield either. When war finally demanded decisions at scale, she did not transform into something new. She applied familiar methods to unfamiliar arenas. The absence of early military narrative is not a gap to be filled with speculation. It is evidence of how medieval systems produced capable actors without recognizing them. Joan of Flanders was shaped not by destiny, but by structure, and by a silence that would later attempt to contain her. The crisis that forced Joan of Flanders into open command did not arrive gradually. It struck with the precision of political capture. In the year 1341, her husband, John of Montfort, was seized at Nantes by forces aligned with the French-backed Blois faction. With his imprisonment, the Montfort claim in Brittany faced immediate collapse. Authority did not transfer automatically. It evaporated. Garrisons hesitated. Allies recalculated. Without intervention, the cause would dissolve before a battle was fought. Joan acted before legitimacy could be redefined against her. She declared her son the rightful heir to Brittany and positioned herself not as claimant but as custodian of continuity. This distinction mattered. She did not challenge inheritance norms directly. She exploited their dependence on guardianship. In a system that denied her formal succession, she embedded herself within it as the only functioning authority available. This move carried risks beyond politics. By assuming command, Joan crossed from governance into war, a boundary medieval society guarded carefully. There was no precedent for a woman directing a regional conflict at this scale. Support from England did not resolve the problem. Foreign backing could supply troops and coin, but not acceptance among Breton lords whose loyalty depended as much on custom as on advantage. Joan compensated by making her authority visible and unavoidable. She moved between fortresses, supervised defenses, and issued orders directly. Chroniclers recorded her presence in armor not as ceremony but as disruption. She appeared where women were not expected to be performing, functions reserved for men whose legitimacy derived from lineage and arms. Her authority rested entirely on personal credibility, reinforced through action rather than title. Resistance followed quickly. Male commanders questioned her capacity. Allies treated her as a provisional solution rather than a sovereign actor. Yet the pressure of war narrowed options. When her decisions produced results, objections receded. When fortresses held and supply lines remained open, her leadership became difficult to dismiss without jeopardizing survival itself. The Montfort position remained structurally weak. French forces supporting the Blois claim possessed superior numbers, deeper reserves, and closer access to royal backing. Joan could not contest them in open battle without risking annihilation. Instead, she adopted a strategy of denial. She focused on holding ports, maintaining communication with England, and preventing decisive engagements that would end the war on unfavorable terms. This was not defensive instinct. It was calculation under imbalance. Her command style emphasized movement and reaction rather than conquest. Garrisons were reinforced selectively. Supplies were concentrated in coastal strongholds instead of exposed inland castles. Control of maritime access took precedence over control of territory. These choices reflected an understanding of warfare in transition where endurance, logistics, and time increasingly outweighed the capture of land. Joan's transformation was neither symbolic nor mythic. She did not become a warrior icon. She became a commander operating under constraint. She sought no recognition beyond what necessity imposed. Each decision extended the conflict, preserved her son's claim, and compelled England to remain committed. Authority in her case was not granted by law or custom. It was imposed by crisis, sustained through competence, and tolerated only so long as it remained indispensable. The struggle over Brittany was never solely a military contest. It was a legal and ideological confrontation disguised as war. Competing claims were advanced not only through force but through interpretation of inheritance, custom, and proximity to royal authority. The Blois faction grounded its legitimacy in descent through the female line, reinforced by explicit support from the French crown. The Montfort claim rested on preference for the male line, upheld less by law than by precedent and political convenience. Neither claim was absolute. Each required enforcement. For Joan of Flanders, this ambiguity was both obstacle and opportunity. She possessed no legal right to rule in her own name. Her authority existed only through her son, whose claim remained theoretical so long as armies decided outcomes. She governed not as duchess but as regent without title, acting for a future ruler whose power depended entirely on present survival. This distinction placed her position under constant scrutiny. Gender intensified this instability. A male regent would have been treated as temporary but legitimate. Joan was treated as conditional. Every decision she made was interpreted not only as strategic choice but as test of whether a woman could be trusted with war. Failure would not discredit her alone. It would retroactively justify her exclusion. Success, meanwhile, offered no guarantee of acceptance, only postponement of removal. Joan responded by transforming legitimacy from a question of right into a question of function. She did not argue her claim. She demonstrated necessity. Her authority was expressed through action that others could not replace without loss. She held the western strongholds that anchored English supply. She coordinated defenses that prevented rapid French consolidation. As long as the war continued, her leadership remained embedded in its structure. Military visibility played a critical role in this process. Joan did not remain behind walls, issuing directives through intermediaries. She appeared in armor, inspected fortifications, and addressed troops directly. These acts were not theatrical gestures. They served to collapse doubt by placing her inside the chain of command. To obey her was to obey the only authority actively present. Legitimacy was further reinforced through endurance. Each month, the Montfort position survived, weakened the Blois claim by denying resolution. French forces could not secure Brittany quickly. English resources continued to flow. Time itself became an ally, and Joan was its custodian. The longer she maintained resistance, the more her authority normalized through repetition. This strategy carried cost. By anchoring legitimacy to performance rather than law, Joan made her position perpetually vulnerable. Any reversal could trigger immediate displacement. There was no institutional buffer to absorb failure. Authority rested entirely on continued effectiveness, an expectation rarely imposed so absolutely on male rulers protected by lineage and ritual. Nevertheless, the system held. Joan preserved the core of Montfort resistance long enough for external power to entrench itself. English commanders adapted their operations to her defensive network. Breton supporters recalibrated loyalty based on survival rather than theory. Legitimacy in practice shifted from parchment to fortification. What emerged was a form of rule defined not by recognition but by indispensability. Joan of Flanders did not win acceptance. She forced dependence. In doing so, she exposed the fragility of medieval political norms under sustained pressure. Authority, when stripped of ceremony, reverted to those who could organize violence, supply, and morale. For a time, that authority rested unmistakably with her. The siege of Hennebont in the year 1342 marked the moment when Joan of Flanders moved from provisional authority to operational command. French forces, numerically superior and supported by the Blois faction, converged on the town with the expectation of a decisive reduction. Hennebont was not merely a fortress. It was a coastal hinge linking inland Brittany to the sea. Its fall would sever English supply and collapse Montfort resistance in the west. The attacking army reflected the changing character of medieval warfare. It was no longer a feudal host assembled briefly for demonstration. It was a sustained force, equipped with siege engines, stone throwers, and early bombards intended to exhaust defenders rather than storm walls immediately. The objective was pressure, attrition, and inevitability. Inside the city, Joan organized defense as a system rather than a reaction. Hennebont's fortifications were arranged in depth with inner fallback positions prepared in advance. Gates were reinforced. Towers were stocked. Supplies were rationed according to duration, not optimism. The defense assumed a long siege and acted accordingly. What distinguished Hennebont was the scale of civilian mobilization. Joan did not reserve defense for professional fighters alone. The entire population was absorbed into the war effort. Men reinforced walls and repaired damage. Women carried stone, lime, boiling water, and pitch to the parapets. Clothing was altered for speed of movement, social norms subordinated to survival. This was not symbolic participation. It was functional integration. Such mobilization altered morale on both sides. For the defenders, participation created ownership of survival. For the attackers, resistance exceeded expectation. The city did not behave as a passive object of siege. It responded as an organism repairing, adapting, and resisting continuously. Joan's command role remained visible throughout. Chroniclers note her movement along the walls, directing effort, correcting weakness, and maintaining presence under fire. This visibility served practical ends. It compressed the chain of command. Decisions were made where damage occurred. Authority was immediate, not delegated through layers. The decisive moment came not on the walls but beyond them. Joan observed that the French siege camp, extended and confident, left portions lightly guarded. Siege warfare depended on logistics. Tents, animals, and supply wagons formed the true center of gravity. Joan identified this vulnerability and acted without delay. Leading a mounted force of roughly 300, she rode out from the city in a sudden sortie. The objective was not battle but destruction. The camp was set ablaze. Stores burned. Order dissolved. What had been a methodical siege collapsed into confusion as fire spread faster than command could react. The effect was disproportionate to the size of the force employed. French troops were compelled to abandon positions to contain damage. Momentum was lost. The psychological balance shifted. The siege did not end immediately, but its inevitability was broken. Time returned to the defenders. It was after this action that Joan acquired the name Jeanne la Flamme. The title was not honorific. It was descriptive. Fire had become her operational tool, used not for spectacle but for disruption. Hennebont demonstrated the nature of her command. She did not rely on single combat or heroic stand. She targeted systems, morale, supply coordination. The siege became not a test of walls but a contest of organization. In that contest, Joan proved capable of directing total war within medieval constraints, reshaping the logic of siege warfare through decisive intervention. Victory at Hennebont did not end the war. It prolonged it. For Joan of Flanders, this extension imposed a different burden, sustaining conflict over time. Survival now depended less on dramatic action and more on administration. War became routine, and routine required structure. Joan's authority translated into governance of resources rather than only command of troops. Mercenary forces essential to Montfort's survival demanded regular payment. Delays invited desertion. Joan ensured wages were met through coordination with English financiers and the redirection of local revenues. Coin moved as deliberately as soldiers. Control of money became control of loyalty. Logistics followed the same logic. Supplies flowed not inland where they were vulnerable but along the coast. English shipping delivered grain, arms, and men directly into Breton ports, under Montfort control. These ports functioned as arteries rather than prizes. Their defense was prioritized over expansion. Territory was valuable only insofar as it supported movement and supply. Maritime control therefore shaped every decision. Joan accepted the realities of channel warfare. Royal fleets were insufficient on their own. She tolerated and at times cooperated with privateers and pirates whose interests aligned temporarily with Montfort's survival. Legality at sea was secondary to effect. What mattered was denial of French movement and protection of English convoys. This pragmatism extended to governance during her absence. Joan did not centralize authority exclusively in her person. She constructed defensive systems capable of operating without constant supervision. Garrisons were stocked and commanded with clear instructions. Signal protocols were established. When she left Hennebont to seek reinforcement, the city did not collapse into uncertainty. It held. Her ability to re-enter the theater underscored this systemization. Returning by sea under cover of night, she brought fresh troops directly into contested space. The operation required coordination between naval movement, port control, and internal security. It succeeded because the structure she had built remained functional in her absence. These actions reveal a conception of war closer to administration than to chivalric display. Joan treated conflict as an ongoing process rather than a series of battles. Stability was achieved through predictability, regular pay, reliable supply, disciplined defense. Each reduced the likelihood of sudden collapse. This approach also limited her visibility in narrative terms. Chroniclers favored moments of drama. Administration left fewer vivid images. Yet it was precisely this phase that secured the Montfort position beyond immediate crisis. French forces faced not a single leader to defeat, but an integrated system resistant to disruption. Joan's authority at this stage was less contested because it was less visible. Opposition focused on outcomes rather than propriety. As long as forts held and supplies arrived, objections softened. Competence replaced controversy. The war in Brittany did not pause for symbolism. It demanded endurance. Joan of Flanders provided it by transforming emergency leadership into sustained governance. Her success lay not in personal charisma but in her ability to maintain a functional war economy under siege conditions. In doing so, she demonstrated that medieval power, even under feudal constraint, could be exercised through systems rather than spectacle. By the later phase of the campaign, the struggle for Brittany had shifted decisively toward the sea. Land fortifications could delay conquest, but only maritime control could sustain resistance indefinitely. The English crown understood this, and so did Joan of Flanders. The Channel was no longer a boundary. It was the central theater through which power flowed. The naval engagement off Brest in the year 1342 crystallized this reality. English ships, primarily high-sided cogs, confronted a fleet composed in large part of Genoese galleys, operating in French service. The fleets represented competing naval doctrines. The galleys relied on speedboarding and ramming. The cogs depended on height, stability, and missile dominance. The outcome was determined less by maneuver than by integration. English vessels carried large contingents of archers positioned along elevated decks. From this height, they raked the approaching galleys with sustained fire. Oarsmen were exposed. Command decks were suppressed. Boarding actions failed before contact could be established. The galleys optimized for Mediterranean conditions proved vulnerable in the confined, turbulent waters of the Channel. The result was not a symbolic victory. It was a logistical turning point. French influence along the Breton coast collapsed. Supply routes to the Blois faction became unreliable. English convoys could now move with reduced risk, reinforcing coastal strongholds and sustaining mercenary forces over extended periods. For Joan, the consequences were immediate. Her defensive network was no longer merely surviving, it was stabilized. With maritime access secured, she could plan beyond crisis response. Garrisons received consistent support. Morale hardened. The Montfort cause, once fragile, achieved strategic depth. This phase marked the height of her authority. She was no longer only indispensable in emergency. She was embedded in a functioning war system recognized by English commanders and Breton allies alike. Decisions taken by her administration shaped operations across land and sea. Her role, though still unofficial, became central. Yet this peak also carried the seeds of decline. As the war stabilized, the tolerance extended to exceptional authority narrowed. External powers preferred predictable governance over personal command. The very success of Joan's system reduced the justification for her continued autonomy. Symbolically, she became a figure of resistance. Practically, she remained a manager of logistics and defense. The two roles did not align comfortably. Myths celebrated her visibility at Hennebont. Institutions measured her usefulness in quieter terms. The naval victory off Brest ensured the survival of the Montfort claim. It also shifted the war from immediate contest to prolonged occupation. In that environment, individual authority was gradually absorbed by bureaucratic and dynastic mechanisms beyond her control. Joan of Flanders reached her apex not as a conqueror but as a stabilizer. She held a collapsing system together long enough for others to inherit it. That achievement, rooted in maritime dominance and logistical coherence, marked the moment when her power was greatest and most vulnerable to erasure. The truce concluded at Malestroit in the year 1343 did not mark peace so much as suspension. Hostilities paused, but structures shifted. For Joan of Flanders, the ceasefire altered her position more profoundly than any battlefield reversal. War had justified her authority. Stability began to dissolve it. Under the terms of the truce, Joan was transferred to England officially for protection. The stated rationale was security. The practical effect was removal. Separated from Brittany, she was detached from the system she had built and the command networks that sustained her legitimacy. Authority without proximity proved unsustainable. In England, Joan's role narrowed rapidly. Decision-making passed to male guardians, advisors, and royal administrators. Her previous visibility, once operational necessity, was recast as inconvenience. The war no longer required improvisation. It required management, and management favored established hierarchies. Reports from this period grow ambiguous. Chroniclers began to describe Joan as unstable, erratic, or ill. The language lacks precision and timing. There is no clear incident diagnosis or consistent testimony. What exists instead is narrative shift. A figure once recorded for action is now defined by absence and doubt. The declaration of mental illness functioned as resolution. It explained her exclusion without confronting her record. It rendered her unfit not only for command but for political relevance. Whether the condition described reflected reality remains unresolved. The evidence does not permit certainty. What is clear is context. Joan's removal coincided with the consolidation of authority by external powers. England no longer required a local commander operating independently. Brittany was transitioning from contested space to managed territory. Joan's competence, once essential, became structurally inconvenient. Her isolation deepened. For nearly 3 decades, she lived in confinement under varying degrees of supervision. She did not return to command. She did not influence policy. The silence surrounding these years contrasts sharply with the density of record during crisis. It suggests not irrelevance but deliberate quiet. This phase exposes the limits of performance-based authority. Joan had ruled through necessity, not right. Once necessity receded, so did tolerance. There was no institutional protection to preserve her position or reputation. Power systems that had accepted her leadership under pressure moved to contain it once normality returned. The question of her mental state cannot be answered definitively. To conclude either way would exceed the evidence. What can be observed is the political function of the diagnosis. It transformed a former commander into a dependent, neutralizing potential disruption without public confrontation. Joan of Flanders did not fall in battle. She was withdrawn from relevance. Her authority ended not through defeat, but through reclassification. The system she had sustained no longer required her presence. In that transition, doubt replaced recognition, and confinement replaced command. Joan of Flanders died in the year 1374, having spent nearly 3 decades removed from the arena she once shaped. Her death passed without ceremony, without political consequence, and without immediate reassessment. This absence of reaction was not accidental. By the time she died, the system no longer required explanation for her exclusion. Silence had already done the work. Her confinement ensured that no alternative narrative could develop while outcomes were still contested. She left no faction, no court, no cadre of supporters capable of sustaining her memory as an active political force. Authority had been transferred entirely to male regents, acting in the name of her son. Governance resumed a form more legible to dynastic norms. The Montfort cause, however, did not end with her withdrawal. The structures Joan had preserved endured. Ports remained defensible. English access to Brittany persisted. The war continued, shaped by conditions she had stabilized rather than by her personal command. In this sense, her influence survived her relevance. Her son, John of Montfort, later John IV, inherited not merely a claim but a functioning position. When he achieved decisive victory at Auray in the year 1364, it was treated as culmination of long struggle. Chroniclers framed the outcome as resolution of a male contest, emphasizing battlefield heroics and noble lineage. What disappeared in this retelling was the period of near collapse that preceded his success. Without Joan's intervention, there would have been no prolonged contest to resolve. The victory at Auray rested on foundations laid under her command: territorial survival, maritime access, and continued English engagement. The aftermath of her death confirmed the direction of historical memory. Power consolidated into recognizable forms. Brittany remained under Montfort control, eventually integrated more fully into the structures of French authority. The transitional phase, when a woman had held the system together under extreme pressure, was treated as anomaly rather than precedent. Joan's absence simplified narrative. It allowed historians to present continuity without disruption, succession without complication. Her role could be minimized without challenging outcomes. The war had been won. The state endured. The means no longer mattered. Yet this erasure reveals structural priorities. Medieval chronicles favored legitimacy over function, lineage over performance. Joan embodied the opposite logic. She governed because she could not, because she was permitted. Once her utility expired, so did the incentive to remember her accurately. Her death closed no chapter in policy. It sealed a narrative choice. By allowing her to vanish quietly, the system preserved its appearance of coherence. Brittany's survival could be attributed to dynastic resolution rather than emergency governance. Joan of Flanders left no monument. She left a sequence of outcomes that made later victories possible. Her life illustrates how power can be decisive without being commemorated, and how systems absorb competence while denying recognition. The aftermath of her death was stability. That stability rested in part on foundations she constructed and was never credited for. After Joan of Flanders disappeared from power, she did not disappear from story. She was transformed. What survived of her presence was filtered through channels that favored symbolism over structure and morality over competence. Memory did not erase her outright. It altered her shape. In Breton oral tradition later collected in works such as Barzaz Brise, Joan re-emerged as Jeanne la Flamme, a figure defined by spectacle. Fire replaced administration. The charge from Hennebont overshadowed years of coordination, finance, and endurance. She became an image rather than an operator. This transformation preserved her visibility while emptying it of strategic substance. Such mythologization was not neutral. By emphasizing singular acts of defiance, tradition isolated her from the systems she sustained. She appeared as exception, not as proof. A woman could burn a camp. She could not manage a war. The narrative contained her within drama, preventing her from challenging assumptions about authority. Written chronicles followed a different path but reached similar ends. Male clerics and court historians framed events through dynastic logic. They focused on claims, treaties, and noble lineages that aligned with institutional continuity. Joan's role disrupted this framework. She governed without title. She commanded without sanction. Chroniclers responded by compressing her presence or questioning her stability. The label of madness proved especially effective. It required no detailed evidence and foreclosed reconsideration. Once applied, it retroactively justified her removal and explained her silence. A woman who commanded effectively had to be neutralized conceptually as well as politically. Instability served that function. This distortion did not require conspiracy. It emerged naturally from who wrote history and for whom. Chronicles were produced within male-dominated institutions serving monarchies that depended on predictable hierarchies. Joan's career did not fit comfortably within those hierarchies. To emphasize her competence would invite questions the system preferred not to answer. Centralizing states also benefited from minimizing her role. Both England and France moved toward more bureaucratic forms of warfare and governance. Transitional figures who operated outside formal structures complicated the narrative of orderly evolution. Joan represented improvisation under pressure, not planned reform. Her effectiveness challenged the idea that authority flowed only from recognized institutions. As a result, her image fractured. In some accounts, she was celebrated briefly and then dismissed. In others, she was acknowledged only to be diminished. Rarely was she analyzed as a commander managing logistics, morale, and maritime access over multiple years. That level of analysis would require taking her authority seriously. The question then is not why Joan was forgotten, but why she was remembered incorrectly. Her erasure was not total. It was selective. Memory preserved what could be contained and discarded what could not. Fire was acceptable. Administration was not. Madness was narratively useful. Competence was disruptive. This pattern reveals how historical memory operates as power. What is emphasized determines what can be repeated. What is minimized defines the boundaries of legitimacy. Joan of Flanders survived in story only after being stripped of the very qualities that made her decisive. The distortion of her legacy was not an accident of time. It was the result of systems protecting their coherence. By reshaping her into symbol and anomaly, history ensured that her example would inspire legend, not imitation. Modern attempts to recover Joan of Flanders begin not with discovery but with reassembly. The sources have always existed. What changed was the willingness to read them against their silences. Medieval chroniclers such as Jean le Bel and Jean Froissart recorded her actions in fragments, observations embedded within accounts of campaigns, treaties, and dynastic maneuvering. They did not deny her presence. They failed to center it. Jean le Bel, writing close to events, treated Joan primarily as an operational reality. He described her movements, her visibility in armor, her role in sustaining resistance. His tone was observational rather than celebratory. Authority was noted because it functioned. Froissart, writing later, and with greater concern for narrative symmetry, recast the conflict into chivalric terms. In his account, Joan's role narrowed as the story required clearer male protagonists and cleaner lines of succession. This divergence matters. It reveals not contradiction but compression over time. As the war moved from contingency to outcome, the need to acknowledge improvised authority diminished. Joan's command belonged to a phase of instability that later historians preferred to treat as transitional noise rather than structural necessity. Recent scholarship has returned to this unstable phase with different priorities. Historians such as Julie Sarpy have argued that Joan's confinement cannot be understood solely through the lens of personal illness. The timing, duration, and political context suggest deliberate isolation rather than medical inevitability. Sarpy does not deny the possibility of psychological decline. She questions its explanatory dominance. This distinction is critical. To attribute Joan's removal entirely to mental collapse absolves institutions of responsibility. To consider political containment reintroduces agency, not only hers, but that of those who benefited from her silence. The English crown, particularly under Edward III, had reason to stabilize command structures and reduce reliance on autonomous regional figures. Joan's competence made her useful in crisis and inconvenient afterward. Reconstruction, therefore, requires reading absence as evidence. The sudden thinning of detail surrounding her later life contrasts sharply with earlier documentation. This is not the pattern of gradual fading. It is the pattern of exclusion. Records do not diminish because nothing happened. They diminish because what happened was no longer meant to circulate. Modern historiography also reframes her actions within the evolution of warfare. Joan was not an outlier operating beyond her time. She was aligned with emerging realities: professional soldiers, paid service, maritime logistics, civilian mobilization. These elements would define late medieval and early modern conflict. Her command anticipated institutional developments that later states would formalize. Yet because she operated without formal office, her contributions resist categorization. She left no edicts, no permanent administrative reforms bearing her name. Her impact was operational rather than constitutional. This makes her harder to integrate into linear narratives of state formation which favor documented change over practiced adaptation. Reconstructing Joan of Flanders is therefore an act of realignment. It requires shifting focus from titles to functions, from legitimacy to effectiveness. It asks whether history records who was permitted to rule, or who actually held systems together when they failed. The answer determines her place. If authority is measured by endurance, coordination, and outcome, Joan cannot be peripheral. She becomes central to understanding how medieval warfare transitioned from feudal display to sustained operation. Restoring her record does not add a footnote. It alters the frame. Her life demonstrates that power can exist without sanction, shape outcomes without recognition, and vanish from memory without ever truly being defeated. Joan of Flanders matters not because she was unusual, but because she was effective in a system that denied her formal space. Her career forces a reconsideration of how power functioned in late medieval Europe at the precise moment when warfare administration and authority were undergoing structural change. She did not operate outside history. She operated at its hinge. Her command demonstrates that military leadership was never solely a function of gender, even when ideology insisted otherwise. What limited women was not incapacity but recognition. Joan organized defense, sustained logistics, coordinated naval access, and maintained morale under siege conditions that defeated many titled commanders. Her authority emerged not from exception but from alignment with the actual demands of war. This distinction is critical. Joan was not a symbolic rupture. She was evidence of continuity between feudal governance and professionalized warfare. She managed paid soldiers, negotiated maritime supply, and mobilized civilian labor as part of defense. These practices would later be institutionalized by states that excluded her from their origin stories. Her erasure reveals how historical memory selects for form over function. Titles endure. Systems disappear into outcome. Joan did not found institutions that bore her name. She maintained structures long enough for others to inherit them. When those structures stabilized, her role became narratively unnecessary. The question of gender remains inseparable from this process, but it is not the sole explanation. Joan was marginalized because she embodied authority without legitimacy, competence without sanction. Such figures complicate linear accounts of state development. They expose how much depends on improvisation during crisis, and how quickly that improvisation is disowned once order returns. Joan of Flanders also occupies a critical position in the transformation of medieval warfare. Her command linked older feudal forms with emerging systems of total mobilization, maritime dominance, and sustained siege operations. She understood that walls alone did not decide wars. Supply did, access did, time did. These insights were not theoretical, they were applied. In this sense, she stands between eras. Behind her lay ritualized conflict and seasonal campaigning. Ahead lay standing forces, centralized logistics, and naval supremacy. She did not create these developments, but she navigated them earlier than most under conditions of extreme constraint. Restoring Joan to the historical record alters more than representation. It challenges assumptions about how power is transmitted and remembered. It suggests that the history of state formation is incomplete without acknowledging those who stabilized systems without being permitted to rule them formally. She was not remembered because she did not fit the story that followed. That story favored continuity through male succession, centralized authority, and legal legitimacy. Joan represented contingency, competence, and survival under collapse. Once collapse was avoided, she became inconvenient. To tell her history is not to elevate a forgotten heroine. It is to restore a missing mechanism. Joan of Flanders held a war together at the moment it should have ended. She preserved a political future that others would later claim as inevitable. History did not forget her by chance. It moved past her deliberately. Recovering her place forces recognition of how much of the medieval world was held together not by sanctioned rulers but by those who acted when systems failed and were erased once they succeeded.